Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the Eagle Nest Wilderness in central Colorado on top of Eccles Peak with a Buffalo Pass there below and behind me. Today we're going to go back into that post-American series I've been doing every once in a while, and specifically talking about one of the hot spots, and that will be Poland. Now, Poland is one of those countries that we don't think of very often as a major power because it has been so badly treated throughout history. It's got major powers around it, specifically Sweden, Russia, and Germany, and it tends to get gobbled up by them very easily. Its coastline isn't great, and so the Swedes have always been able to predate upon them. And then its land borders with both the Germans and the Russians are wide open, so there's no chance of doing any sort of static defense. As such, the Polish military in modern times is heavy on air power with extended-ranged fuel tanks, so that while they might not be able to stop a Russian invasion, they can reach Moscow and bomb it, and at least make the Russians think twice. That's kind of their national strategy here. And then, of course, they're never sure if they can rely upon the Germans, because every time the Germans have gone on the warpath, Poland is usually one of the first couple of stops. Things are going to change over the course of the next 20 years for a number of reasons, but really the biggest chunk is economics and demography. The Germans and the Russians have two of the worst demographic structures on the planet. And while Sweden is an up-and-coming power again, and it can definitely punch above its weight, this is not the 1600s, and Sweden today has under 10 million people. So even if it punches like triple its weight, Poland still has 40 million people. Also, the Swedes these days are not looking to expand into empire, so, there's that. Anyway, what this means is that we're seeing an opening window of opportunity for Poland. As the German system fails because of demographic decline and economic collapse, remember, this is a country that exports everything, so anything happens to globalization, they're done. Also, they can't maintain their workforce for more than another 10 years. Russia is only slightly behind that in terms of demographic decline. In fact, once you look at the health figures, it's probably worse. Everyone in Germany, at least, is in decent health. You've got a lot of alcoholism and a lot of HIV and a lot of tuberculosis in Russia. You don't have any of those in Poland. Which means that for the Russians, things are going to go one of two directions. Either, number one, they're going to win hand over fist in Ukraine, and then they're going to come for Poland, and we're going to have a knockdown, drag-out fight. At some point over the next 20 years, the Russian wave will crest, and then it'll fall back because they won't be able to maintain their military structures, and we'll have the Poles being more and more and more aggressive, assuming they don't fall completely, and pushing into the former Russian space in order to break it up so nothing like that can ever happen again. For those of you who don't think that can happen, it's happened before. The Russians call it the time of troubles, and that brings us to the second possibility, that in Ukraine, that this is all that the Russians can do. And this war will break them in the next few years. And then the Poles will push more and more aggressively into the Russian space to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again. Remember, in the 1600s, 1604, I believe, the Poles actually occupied Moscow and held it for a generation. Only this time, the Russians would be in economic and demographic decline, if not outright collapse. So it might actually last a little bit longer. Now, for those of you who are Polish, don't do too much chest beating. A lot of things have to happen. Poland, like Romania, really only does well when the countries on its edges are weak. The problem you have in Poland is it's just big enough to think that it can pull this off by itself, whereas the Romanians know that they have to partner with somebody. Now, there are two paths for the Poles to take. Option number one is economic collapse and a statist economy followed by a military expansion. Probably the most likely outcome. Remember that Poland today is economically wealthy because of its relationship with German manufacturing. And if that goes away, option number two is the Swedes step in and become the new partner, both demographically, economically, strategically. And you get Polish land power with Swedish amphibious power, and that could be a very potent combination in the Baltic, sharing a lot of common values and maybe even having a vector of American assistance in there. That's kind of the playbook as I see it right now. And finally, before Poles get too excited, keep in mind that Polish demographics are not all that much better than Russian or German. I mean, they're better, but they're aging just as fast, just from a younger base. So if we're looking at an end to the German and the Russian systems over the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, We're also looking at a complete refabrication of the Polish system over the next 20 to 50 years. So there's going to be a window here where Poland becomes the most powerful land power in the region, and it is a moment in time. And what the Poles decide to do with that is going to reshape this region for at least the next century.
Oh, and one more thing about Poland. They are preparing for this future. In the aftermath of the beginning of the Ukraine war, when the Russians proved that they were not the military superpower everybody thought they were, all of a sudden a land war in Poland didn't seem nearly as stupid. And so the Polish government fast-forward plans to expand their tank force. They cut a deal with the South Koreans and have already imported 180 tanks from Korea's stocks. And there are plans underfoot, already in development, to manufacture another 800 and some within Poland itself. When this is finished, and it's supposed to be finished within 3 years, it's not that Poland will have a more powerful tank force than the United Kingdom or France or Italy or Germany. It's that it'll have a more powerful tank force than the United Kingdom and France and Italy and Germany. So all of a sudden, looking back at history, a second run at Moscow doesn't seem nearly as crazy.
Efficiency, precision, speed, effectiveness, accuracy. All these and more are things we think of as characteristically German. Here's another one: dying. Europe faces the reintroduction of a Germany desperate to preserve its post-war gains in an environment where mere survival is beyond its ability. From an economic point of view, Germany's geography is too good. Between the Rhine, Elbe, Oder, Danube, and a half-dozen minor rivers, Germany boasts about 2,000 miles of natural waterway. The Rhine and Elbe access the North Sea. The Oder empties to the Baltic, and the Danube winds to the Black, and from there, the Mediterranean. Germany's river footprints grant it the best economic access of any territory in Europe. But what makes sense economically does not always make sense in other ways. Squatting squarely amid the Elbe, Rhine, and Upper Danube are Germany's central uplands, a rugged, densely forested mountain knot that resists infrastructure even in the 21st century. Germans tend to live in an inverted V, roughly following the Rhine and Elbe, arcing around the central uplands. German lands are traditionally both Europe's richest lands and their most separated. The lands at Germany's edges are its core territories. Historically, other, more consolidated European powers have had a breezy time of taking what they want from the Germans. The early Germans dealt with this the only way they could, by organizing into something better: a stronger educational system, a better workforce, more reliable financing, more productive manufacturing systems. Yet the geographic separation of the central uplands made it impossible for the pre-industrial Germans to do this at the national level. Civic governments became responsible for issues of finance and infrastructure, and education and foreign policy normally reserved for national authorities. Germany's independent city-states tended to develop organizational capabilities at the local level far superior to those at the national level of their much larger neighbors. Excellent civil government is part and parcel of what it means to be German. For most of German history, there was no Germany. Identities and competencies were a strictly local and regional affair. Nearly all German cities have a lengthy stretch in their past in which they were the core of a small German kingdom. Only the most successful of these German statelets, Prussia, a heavily militarized state that originated in the northeastern German lands, ever got big enough to achieve any economies of scale. The arrival of the industrial technologies in German lands in the 1840s and 1850s found fertile ground in dozens of advanced cities that could all apply all the technologies all at once. Among the first things this constellation of German urban regions did was run industrial road and rail links to one another. German industrialization made German unification not only possible, but inevitable. Some German communities, used to functioning as independent powers, resisted. So did all the Germans' neighbors, who rather enjoyed having shattered, easily exploitable people next door. But with new roads and rails enabling direct inter-German commerce and cultural consolidation, they were denying reality. Between 1864 and 1871, the various German statelets found themselves on multiple sides of three major wars. By the end of 1871, it was all over. A unified Germany was, finally, born. The fusing of Germany's industrialization and unification processes shaped Europe's next several decades. Contemporary Germany's biggest problem is demographic. When Germany industrialized, the entire country did so at once, which means it also urbanized all at once, which means the German birth rate started falling throughout German lands all at once, and it never stopped. Birth rates might tick up on occasion during economic booms, but with most Germans living in cramped conditions, there's a big difference between deciding to try for a second kid and a third one. About the only thing that encourages people to have more kids is for people to have more space. That's why Germany did have a baby boomlet during a period they understandably don't enjoy discussing. The Lebensraum era of the late 1930s, when Germany was busy annexing its neighbors and getting physically bigger. Germany's World War II defeat wasn't simply economically, culturally, and militarily jarring. It physically reduced the size of post-war Germany by roughly a quarter. The post-war governments of Germany's neighbors forcibly ejected the Germans living in the formerly German lands. Post-war German authorities almost universally settled these expellees, who accounted for about 18% of the population of the combined West Germany and East Germany, in urban apartments with little space for living, much less procreating. Contemporary German social stability is predicated upon a generous, ironclad, cradle-to-grave system of government services. Germany has been able to afford it because of a triple quirk in its demographic structure. Both East and West Germany enjoyed a brief baby boom between 1955 and 1965. That generation has been working and paying taxes for decades, and in the 2010s is at the height of its earning and tax-paying years. Germany's boomers didn't have many children, circumscribing expenses for services like primary education and childcare. The state instead directs the savings into value-added items, like higher education and infrastructure. Some 8 million Germans died in the world wars, gutting populations that would have been retirees in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. High tax receipts plus few dependents equals excellent government finances. But this golden age of high tax receipts and low government payouts is ending. With the exception of the Lebensraum, German reproductive rates have been edging down for 16 decades and are now far past terminal. The nearly childless German baby boomer generation enters mass retirement in the 2020s, cursing contemporary Germany with a collapse in productive capacity, a collapse in tax receipts, a collapse in consumption, and an explosion of state outlays for pensions and health care. As soon as 2030, the young generation entering the workforce will be less than half the size of the boomer generation retiring. In any normal country, this would spell economic and social failure. Such ruin assumes that economic trends in Germany are positive. The quest for efficiency and quality, so central to German identity, comes at a cost. All those local and regional German governments try to capture private savings to fund community goals, leaving little in the way of financial resources for the development of a consumption-centric culture. Pair high production with low consumption, and the only option is to export the difference. Late 1800s Imperial Germany was able to absorb its output because then, like 1990s China, Germany was industrializing. But by 1900, over half the population had moved off the farm, making it the world's first majority urbanized country. An achievement, yes, but there was nowhere else for its production to go, except abroad. The mix of overproduction and subsequent imperial trade barriers ensured a litany of recessions, price crashes, and general economic dislocation. European interstate competition, already political, became deeply economic as well. It was only a matter of time until it became strategic. The first of those strategic competitions, World War I, ended with German defeat and kicked off the Great Depression, which struck nowhere worse than where it started, in Germany. Americana tells tales of Depression-era city folk returning to the farms to work the land during the Depression's deepest years. Not so in Germany, where the majority of Germans had been living in cities for decades. The only thing the Germans could do to keep costs down was to not have children. Germany's post-Cold War unification was a phenomenal national achievement. But that doesn't mean there were no side effects. The new national government decreed that the value of the former West and East German currencies would be broadly equalized, despite the East's far less advanced industrial plans. The valuation decision aimed to preserve the personal savings of the former East Germans. a political necessity in savings-driven Germany, but it has gutted the competitiveness of the East German economy ever since. Not only did this haunt the Germans with echoes of the sort of dislocation and unemployment they experienced during the Great Depression, but family formation, and from it, birth rates in the former East, crashed and never recovered. There is never a good time to have a terminal demography, but contemporary European economic trends argue for now being among the worst. A rapidly shrinking working-age population, paying a higher tax rate to support an ever larger retiree population, means Germany's already weak ability to absorb its own production weakens further. It is more important than ever for the Germans to have a place to send their wares. Germany's biggest exports by value are automotive, with 80% of the cars Germans manufacture at home being sold outside of Germany. The European Union is no longer that place. While few countries have as poor a demographic structure as Germany, most of those in the running are also within the European Union. The rest of Europe has aged beyond being able to serve Germany as an export sink. Europe isn't economically capable of filling that role, even if its demographics were healthy. At least some portion of the continent has been in recession at any given time between 2007 and 2020. Because the Germans provided the largest chunk of the financial assistance required to bail out the EU's failing members, but Berlin conditioned that support on budget cuts. Europe's weaker countries are Europe's weaker countries because they lack Germany's sublime economic geography. The state spending of these weaker states is part of what helped those weaker states close the gap with the Germans. German-imposed austerity gutted growth potential, and from it, Europe's capacity to absorb German products. Northern Europe, with all its flats and seas, is a rough-and-tumble region, with everyone in everyone else's face all the time. Germans, right in the middle of it all, have little choice but to treat military issues the same way they treat everything else, by being better. Germany's very strength invites panicked challenge. The rise and fall of Germany is European history. The only way the Europeans have ever discovered to prevent this never-ending cycle of wars is to change the game, to bring in an external security guarantor who forces everyone to be on the same side. In Europe, the institution that operationalizes the American-led order is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The NATO alliance shoehorned all European militaries, Germany included, into a single command and logistical structure under American strategic and operational authority. NATO's twin goals were to force an internal Western European peace while also securing Western Europe against Soviet aggression. As Hastings Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, so famously put it, the alliance's raison d'etre was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. With the Cold War's end, Germany entered the best of all possible worlds. NATO expanded into the former Soviet Empire, surrounding Germany with allies. Germany's military ceased being relevant, largely because it ceased existing. Repeated, past-the-bone budget gougings functionally eliminated all German air, naval, and armored deployment capacity. For all intents and purposes, Germany no longer has a military. From 1990 until 2020, this has been fine. After all, Germany didn't face major security threats. And so the spotlight shifted from NATO to the parallel European institution formed by the Europeans themselves, the European Union. Unlike NATO, which benefits from a very large and in-charge leader and a crystal-clear founding goal, the EU tends to muddle through. Is it an economic union? A financial union? A political union? A counterweight to the United States? A free trade zone? As of early 2020, the EU has 27 members. The British left the EU in 2019, and if you ask the EU's collective leadership any of these questions, you will get at least a half dozen different answers. And that's before getting down to the nitty-gritty details of bank bailouts, or debt levels, or negotiating authority, or political norms, or voting parameters. Even relatively mild disputes require the heads of state hashing out the details during multiple all-night summits. The really big issues, such as how to address a sovereign debt crisis or undocumented migration, occupy all leadership bandwidth for a decade or more. There's also the not-so-minor issue of who's in charge. Formally, the EU presidency rotates among all the members for 6-month terms. Under the order, this slowly, softly, oddly ambling path to integration was fine. The Americans did all the heavy lifting on the security front via NATO, on the global front via their Navy, on the energy front via their position in the Persian Gulf, on the raw materials front via their primacy in the Western Hemisphere and their alliance with Australia, and on the trade front via the World Trade Organization, as well as keeping all of Europe lined up on the same side. Europe could afford to have knockdown, drag-out, multi-day arguments with itself over cheese policy. That's not a joke. For the Germans, all this dysfunction is part of contemporary Europe's beauty. NATO bars security competition among the European powers. No matter how messy or awkward or myopic the EU might become, keeping the field of competition purely economic enables Germany to be physically intact and industrially dynamic. For Berlin, that's what matters. That's all that matters. With wealth rising, stability assured, and the Germans quiescent, many Europeans have come to believe in a heady dream that after centuries of living in the world's most blood-soaked lands, they had finally achieved a sort of historical escape velocity. It's a beautiful dream. I want to believe it too. But with the American abdication of responsibility, that dream dies. Europe is a region of military pygmies who face pressing military challenges. A region suffering demographic implosion, unable to absorb immigrants. A region peppered with xenophobes who cannot control their borders. A region rumbling with environmentalists who cannot generate green power. A region facing a banking crisis that lacks the means of even defining the problem, much less rectifying it. A region that has largely outsourced its relationships with its nearest neighbors of significance, Turkey and Russia, to the departing Americans. A region whose most coherent economic, financial, and military power, the United Kingdom, has left. Europe now faces simultaneous, interlocking crises: currency, finance, banking, monetary policy, supply chains, inequality, migration, oil, natural gas, electricity, demographics, consumption, exports, imports, Libya, Syria, Turkey, Russia. Any response requires that all European states agree on how to prioritize and address each problem. Which means for the Germans, the worst of all worlds is about to arrive. Germany is not a sunny or windy country. Despite spending nearly €2 trillion on alternate energy infrastructure and setting up omnipresent regulatory structures to favor the green tech sector, which have doubled power prices from 2000 levels, which were already more than double average U.S. prices, Germany receives less than 10% of its electricity needs from green power. Germany is more dependent upon fuel imports now than before it started its green surge. Half of Germany's exports and all its energy imports rely on access to countries beyond the EU. The United States is Germany's largest end market, while China ranks third. Nearly all of Germany's manufacturing supply chains rely upon access to countries within the EU. Germany's and Europe's demographic collapse deepens both the consumption and the production problems. With the Americans' departure, security competition is back on the table. As in China, German economic growth has been nothing shy of fantastic. As in China, German economic growth has been possible only due to the changed local security environment and risk-free trade links to the wider world that the order provided. Like China, Germany will suffer hugely from the order's end. Germany is now returning to the same rise and fall cycle that has so defined its history. The Germans are left with starkly limited choices. The North Sea has oil and natural gas, but other countries in the sea's basin, most notably the United Kingdom, already absorb most of what is available via pre-existing infrastructure. The sea's resources are unavailable to Germany. The Middle East has plenty to go around, but that region is on the wrong side of the European continent and Turkey. In a world of unsafe shipping lanes, Germany might as well be on another planet. Labor options are similarly limited. Within Europe, the Scandinavians, British, and French all operate at similar cost structures, so there are few options for operational synergies. Many European countries keep most of their manufacturing supply chains in-house for reasons geographic: the United Kingdom, Sweden, or mercantile, France, Spain. Sometimes it is simply an issue of style. Italy operates differently. Instead of the German approach of assembly lines and mass production, the Italians treat industry more like art, one at a time, handmade outputs. When the Italians handcraft a car, it's a Ferrari. When they mass produce, it's a Fiat. The largest consumption bases locally are the French and British. Even at the height of the order, the French liked to keep their market to themselves. The United Kingdom was more open, but in the aftermath of the Brexit drama, count on access to the British market flat out ending. The Dutch will continue to do business with Germany, but the Netherlands is more a flow-through economy than a large final destination. The 17 million Dutch can absorb only so much. But looking east, the Germans see opportunity. The former Soviet satellites of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary are not only near, but geographic barriers between them and the Germans are minimal. If long-haul energy imports are not an option, Russia is brimming with, relatively, short-haul delivery options, much of which flows via pipes that are already in place. Labor costs in the Central European states are 1/3 or even less of those in Germany. Integrating manufacturing systems with them not only makes economic sense, but also provides economies of scale the Germans could never achieve on their own. Poland and its Central European cohorts may be only about one-half as wealthy as Germany, but there are nearly as many people in those countries as there are Germans in Germany. They provide both manufacturing labor and a consumption base. Just beyond the Central European zone are 44 million Ukrainians and 140-ish million Russians who have proven unable to meet their own manufacture needs in any era. What's left that is worth having fits Germany's needs, and yet remains within reach isn't to the west, but to the east, putting the Germans and the Russians on a collision course. German success puts an integrated German manufacturing system in territory directly adjacent to lands the Russians see as their critical security zone. No more buffer zone. In a post-order world, everyone starts to get agitated again, with German manufacturing becoming a bit less Volkswagen-y and a bit more Panzer-y. And since the Germans will be rearming from a nearly disarmed start, the pace of defense improvement will prove terrifying to anyone who has ever crossed swords, bayonets, or artillery with the Germans in the past. On the flip side, Russian success puts Russian occupational forces within a 4-hour drive of Berlin on a light traffic day. So, where does that take us? One last dance. Germany's core issues of materials and export access are not new. Neither are Russia's concerns with frontiers and internal rebellions. Nor is it the first time the two countries have found themselves in a mutually antagonistic overlap. Historically, when such things happen, the leaders of both countries tend to take deep breaths and have a thorough conversation about the lands between them. They then proceed to draw lines around topics and on maps with the intention of avoiding a bloodbath. The problem is always the same. Divvying up influence over the territories between them is the easy part. Once any agreement is executed, however, the buffer zone between them vanishes, swallowed up by the two powers. Direct borders mean direct competitions. Every time the Germans and Russians reach this point, they eventually end up shooting at each other. The only question is, how long does the honeymoon last? A generation? A decade? Less? The last time, the pact held for only 22 months. This time around, 4 issues argue for, at most, a brief period of coexistence. First, military technologies are evolving again. The last Russo-German war started with artillery and planes. Now there are cruise missiles and jets. As a rule, increases in speed and reach and lethality compress timeframes. Second, change is not simply coming to Germany and Russia's neighborhoods, but to Germany and Russia themselves. Surviving the coming global breakdown will spawn political, social, and economic revolutions in both countries. The last time these two peoples experienced such rapidly shifting fortunes, the results included Nazism and Leninism. The point is less that we'll see a return to fascism in Germany and fascism with a different name in Russia, but instead that the pressures that generated the last, harshly negative government overhaul in both countries are very similar to those of today. For example, consider what drove the fascist rise during the Weimar period of 1930s Germany. Massive dislocation of labor due to new industrial techniques that limited the need for manpower, massive economic dislocations due to disrupted export markets, massive economic inequality, massive population and migration imbalances, and political leaders who weren't so much tone-deaf as trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The Weimar system ultimately found itself overthrown by populists, who were far from shy about lurching Germany in a dangerous new direction. Any of that sound familiar? If the Americans are not managing Europe and seeing to the continent's economic and security needs, then Germany must act like a normal country again. Whatever form the Fifth Reich takes, it cannot possibly be as pacifist and deferential as the Fourth. For Russia, the possibility of a sharp systematic turnover looms even larger. Fewer than 200 people remain in Russia's intelligence officials-dominated political elite. Russia is now firmly in the zone where a single plane crash or assassination campaign or bad flu season could trigger a government breakdown or coup. The third argument for a quick slide into confrontation has to do with the limited time remaining for the countries themselves. Both countries suffer from demographic weakness so extreme as to be a country-killing issue all by itself. The time horizon is so short that most Germans and Russians alive today will live to see the end. That end might come sooner than even the country's abysmal demographic profile suggests, because not all revolutions succeed. When a political, economic, or cultural system experiences violent overhaul, there is typically a multi-year period of reset, while the old system is being wiped away, but the new system hasn't fully replaced it. The last time that happened in Germany, it involved the World War II defeat. The last time for Russia, the post-Cold War breakdown. In each case, simply finding the floor took at least half a decade. A failed political, social, and economic transformation now would likely gobble up so much of what little time Germany or Russia have remaining that they never recover. And that's before one considers the bilateral competition. What might a successful Russia do to take advantage of a failed Germany, or vice versa? A German failure to secure an economic orbit, or a Russian failure to secure better borders, really does mean the end this time around. The all-or-nothing nature of this competition intensifies pressures, raises stakes, and, again, compresses timeframes. Both countries are quite literally raging against the dying of the light. Which brings us to the fourth and final reason this is a struggle unlikely to end in a calm co-dominion over Central and Eastern Europe. Germany and Russia are not the only fish in the pond. At the top of the list of states of concern must be the United States. It isn't that the Americans are likely to see anything that overly bothers them in the intensifying German-Russian collaboration-cum confrontation directly, but instead that actions by either Berlin or Moscow may inadvertently rub Washington the wrong way and prompt American action. A world in which American interests in Europe are not grounded in NATO, and the order is one in which American involvement is far more likely to be corporate. Because Germany's primary motivation is to secure an economic sphere of influence, the Americans and Germans could well find themselves tangling over this or that market or resource flow. A failure in Berlin to manage such entanglement effectively could sever what few connections to the wider world Germany would have otherwise managed to maintain. The Americans can easily operate beyond Europe, while Germany cannot at all. A falling out between Washington and Moscow would likely have a more visceral outcome. The United States defense and intelligence community has decades of experience in countering all things Russian. That experience, and the information and weapon systems that go with it, can easily be shared with countries or ethnic groups that could do Russia irreparable harm. British intervention is less of an if and more of a how. For the better part of the past 3 centuries, the United Kingdom, and the British Empire before it, was involved in over a dozen wars and near-war competitions with both the Germans and Russians, sometimes at the same time. In part, it was because London is an inveterate sea power, while Germany and Russia are land powers. In part, it was because at the height of the empire, the British were sort of fighting with everyone. But in the years to come, British motivation will follow 2 themes. First, it's simply good strategy. British policy since the beginning has been to prevent the formation of a European navy that can threaten Great Britain. The easiest way to achieve that goal is to take preventative measures so no single power can rule all of continental Europe. A fully united Europe would be a peer, not with Britain, but with the United States, and the navy it could float would be able to sweep the British from the seas. Taking preemptive action to prevent the rise of a European hegemon is as central to British identity as a gin and tonic and sturdy rain gear. The 2 countries that have come closest to dominating Europe since 1850 are Germany and Russia. For London, the possibility of Germany and Russia disappearing from Europe forever is too tantalizing a possibility to do anything but encourage. Second, there will definitely be a revenge play. When it comes to Russia, the same Russian cyber tools that have so inflamed American politics have been used the same way in the United Kingdom on both sides of the Scottish independence issue, the Brexit issue, and the rise and fall of both the Conservatives and the Labourites. The Brits would love for that sort of shit to stop, for good. Against Germany, British motivations are more instinctive. There is a powerful strand of thinking among the English that the Germans should have been more understanding of the British divorce from the European Union. While at the same time of this writing, the Brexit drama remains a work in progress. It is already messy, and the British economy is facing a multi-year depression. Yet Britain is an experienced sea power that can apply diplomatic, economic, financial, and military pressure nearly anywhere it wants without fear of reprisal. And it has centuries of experience applying that pressure to Europe. Payback's a bitch. Next comes a family of nations, the Scandinavians. The region's mix of geographies is eclectic in the extreme. Norway is in effect a city-state with a ridiculously long ocean frontage. Finland lost its best territory to the Soviets in World War II, and at times has resembled an armed camp. Denmark is an island nation with an almost British worldview. The Balts were Soviet-occupied. Sweden has fought wars with pretty much everyone in the region on multiple occasions. With the Americans gone, no one will stand up for them, save one another. Courtesy of the exploits of Danish and Swedish Vikings, all are quite literally family. None will exactly be enthused about German activism, but ultimately it is Russia that keeps Scandinavian leaders up at night. The only way the Russians can truly be secure is if the Baltic Trio once again becomes subordinate to Moscow. That alone will prove sufficient to make the Scandinavians close ranks, and maybe even lead them to cheer the Germans on, through clenched teeth. Finally, there is one power in particular that will perceive any iteration of a German-Russian love fest as nothing short of horrifying: Poland. Poland has warred with the Germans and Russians more than any other European nation, and on 2 occasions was divvied up and devoured by its 2 larger neighbors. In a straight-up fight, the Poles don't stand a chance. Their population is half that of Germany, and their level of economic development is not all that much better than Russia's. They lack the demographic, economic, or technical prowess to go toe-to-toe with either Germany or Russia, much less Germany and Russia. But 3 points come to mind. First, unlike the World War II carve-up, this time around the Poles are industrialized. They'd still lose, but they'd certainly put up a bigger fight than the 3 weeks it took the Soviets and Germans to snuff them out in 1939. Second, they'd get loads of help. Anything that keeps the Germans and Russians focused on another land power is one that takes the pressure off the more maritime British and Scandinavians. In the end, the maritime powers, with their more diversified economies, easier supply lines, better demographics, and superior strategic insulation, really just need to play for time. Poland can buy some for them, but only if it doesn't get steamrolled. Expect to see extensive naval, air force, logistics, materiel, intelligence, and completely disavowable special forces assistance. Third, nuclear weapons could very well enter the mix. In the order, countries have typically sought nuclear weapons to deter countries they feared might prove unbeatable in a conventional war. Israel against the Arab powers, Pakistan against India, North Korea and Iran against the United States. But remove the Americans from the mix, and the list of countries that might find a nuclear deterrent useful changes and expands. Japan and Taiwan against China. South Korea against North Korea and Japan. Saudi Arabia against Iran. Finland, Sweden, Germany, and especially Poland against Russia. There isn't anything secret about how to make an atomic weapon. The technologies involved have existed since the 1940s. Back then, the Americans did it start to finish in about 4 years at a budget of less than $25 billion in today's dollars, with some 90% of that budget going toward the production of fissile material available today as waste product from every existing nuclear power plant. Nukes, especially if the intent is to lob it at your next-door neighbor rather than sling it around the planet, are not hard. And if the Germans and Russians come sniffing around Central Europe after the Americans go home, no one needs nukes more than the Poles. A nuclear-infused stalemate among Germany, Poland, and Russia would hamstring Germany's economic plans as well as Russia's security expansion, while also ensuring Poland's survival, all without a shot being fired. That might make it the best of all worlds for everyone, save Germany and Russia. Which means that any serious Polish effort to develop a deterrent would likely be met by exactly the sort of assault the Poles would be hoping to forestall. Can Germany and Russia survive their challenges in this sort of degraded economic and security environment, even if they can somehow avoid coming to blows? The honest answer is probably not. Neither country has enough staying power to make it through this competition, and there are too many countries capable and close that have a vested interest in their mutual failure. What is certain is, whether it takes the form of collaboration or confrontation on any given day, in their death throes, Berlin and Moscow will only have eyes for each other, and those unfortunate enough to be caught in the line of their gaze.
Everybody, Peter Zeihan here. We are continuing our post-American series about what the world will look like and where the hot spots will be after the United States retrenches from its current position. Coming to you from the Eagle's Nest Wilderness just below Gore Lake. And today we are going to discuss the East Asian Rim. This one's a little bit of an anomalous issue considering the series, but whatever. In that this is an area that the Americans are going to remain very engaged. In part of it, it's about managing the Chinese decline, but in part it's because the United States has a couple of very powerful, creative, capable allies that Americans appreciate. The first one is Australia, which is arguably the staunchest ally the United States has. And it has always, well, for the last 50 years at least, served as a bit of a deputy for American interest in Southeast Asia, which is a region that the United States is interested in, but has never really had the time to give the amount of attention that it deserves, and that's where the Australians come in. They've got excellent relations with most of the countries in the region, most notably Singapore and Indonesia. And then, of course, you've got New Zealand there as a sidekick. Anyway, part of the reason that the United States has given nuclear-powered submarines and a free trade deal to the Australians is because they've been so loyal and so long in areas that are out of theater. They participated in Vietnam and Korea. They participated in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've always been there because they know at the end of the day, if they don't have a partnership with the Americans, then they are on their own, and they can read a map and they realize they're wildly outnumbered in the region. So it is a strategy that they've been following for decades. It's a strategy that has borne a lot of fruit, and it's a strategy that will continue to serve them well into the future. The other country is more of a newcomer, and that's Japan. Now, throughout the Cold War, the Japanese were a bit combination of seething and shell-shocked. They had been defeated soundly in World War II. They had been nuked twice, which was something that didn't happen to Nazi Germany, and the post-war settlements were, if anything, harsher on the Japanese than they were on the Germans. And so there's always this lingering nationalist ideal in Japan that wanted to move beyond the American alliance network of the Cold War. But between the defeat, the occupation, American military force, and the Soviets and the Chinese right there, they never really had that choice. Well, over the last 15 years, politics in Japan have evolved. It's not that the nationalism is gone, no. But the Chinese have become a much more clear and present danger than they thought the Chinese could ever be. And the Russians, with their weakness in the Ukraine war, are showing themselves to be wobbly, which means that the Japanese have become very thoughtful about what their possibilities might become, that some things may not be what they thought, some might be harder, some might be easier. And in that sort of mindset, when you're dealing with a demographic that is in terminal decline, you realize you probably are not going to be able to go it alone, so it's best to look for partners who are going to see the world through a similar lens. And that has led them willingly back to the United States. Over the course of the last 15 years, the Japanese have built a pair of very large carriers, not quite super carriers, but the aircraft that operate from them are the Joint Strike Fighter that is made in the United States. And the Japanese gotten closer and closer and closer and managed to strike a deal both with the Trump and with the Biden administration on the future of bilateral relations. So it's not that Japan is not capable. It's the second most powerful navy in the world by most measures. It's that Japan has chosen that rather than going it alone, it's opening them the door on a protracted partnership with the United States and with Australia. And that puts major American power at 3 points of the Pacific, bracketing nicely where the Russians are and where the Chinese are. So for the future of this region, it's going to come down to how powers do or do not get along with the trilateral alliance. Some, like the Chinese, are destined to break, not probably because of military confrontation, but because of their own internal issues, which means this is going to be a zone of chaos, opportunity, carpetbagging, for those of you who bothered to learn Mandarin, something like that. It's going to be impossible to put troops on the ground and stabilize something the size of China, even if you wanted to. So it's probably just going to be a security black hole for a good long time. And then there's other powers like Taiwan or Korea that get along pretty well with the United States and, to a lesser degree, the Japanese, but are going to have to decide just how hand in glove they want to work. This is one of those things that popped up earlier this year when the Biden administration had the Japanese and the Koreans to Camp David to basically hammer out a peace deal that dates back not to World War II, but to 1905, when the Japanese occupied and colonized the Koreans. If the Japanese and the Koreans can agree to get along, then we can have a mini globalization in East Asia, because Taiwan's almost a rounding error at that point, that also involves Southeast Asia. But if the Koreans decide to go a different direction, then there's a very big security problem, because the Japanese will never be secure so long as the Koreans are a hostile power. So a lot of this remains an act in progress, but we're starting to see the outlines of a post-Russia, post-Chinese Asia already, and it speaks with an Australian and a Japanese accent. All right, that's it. Bye.